Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. So I thought, just since I talked last time about kind of shaking up the reading order, I had left off on, when talking about the individual books, I had left off on number 9. And I did a video earlier about maybe shaking things up and reading 11 before you read 10. So I thought, well, maybe speak a little bit about 11 before speaking up about 10 for the video series. So let's jump straight from the videos with Greg, which I hope you watched because I think they're superior, where we kind of broke down Jokertown Shuffle a little bit, Volume 9. So that was all about, if you recall, about the rocks, which is Ellis Island repurposed into a homeland for jokers, but also a hideout or a safe haven for a group of criminals called the Jumpers, a group of people all sort of created by a single ace named St. John Latham, a bunch of sort of teen delinquents who are able to switch bodies, do some body snatching, commit horrible crimes, and then retreat back to the rocks where Bloat, the superpowered Joker, kind of keeps them safe. The rocks again being Ellis Island, but reshaped via Bloat's telekinesis into a sort of true island, sort of Bloat's aesthetic being influenced by Dungeons and Dragons, so it becomes a sort of giant castle with a moat and turrets, and he creates various fantasy creatures out of seemingly nothing, sort of riding around on airborne seahorses or whatever else, and so the island is very well protected thanks to this Bloat superpower. Bloat's disfigurement or Joker feature being that he's completely immobile because he's this sort of massive giant slug with just a sort of teenager's torso at the normal looking teenage torso at the top, but mostly just sort of mounds and mounds of sort of slug-like fat, and that keeps him sort of bound in this one location. But with his mind, he's able to create this sort of paradise for the rest of the people who live on the island, both the Jokers and the Jumpers. The other plot thread was Tachyon, who's been body swapped by his grandson Blaze, who is one of the Jumpers, who decided to sort of sadistically torture his grandfather Tachyon in a lot of different ways, including transferring his body into that of a normal teenage girl with no telepathic powers, and frail enough and weak enough that Blaze is empowered to abuse her and degrade her in many ways, and leaves her pregnant. And Volume 9 ends with Tachyon, the female Tachyon, escaping from the rocks, but meanwhile Blaze has stolen Tachyon's spacecraft and is heading back to Tachyon's homeworld of Takis. That's kind of the hard cliffhanger that is resolved in Volume 10, which is why it does certainly make sense to go straight from 9 to 10. I mean, it makes numerical sense too, but there's that whole situation where Volume 10, Double Solitaire, depicts Tachyon's following Blaze back to Takis, and then from there you get a bunch of politicking, and then Volume 11, Dealer's Choice, deals with the situation on Earth with the rocks and Bloat and the Jumpers and all of that. So Dealer's Choice is definitely one for it puts you in mind of like some of the old like Stan Lee hype that would appear on those old Marvel comics, where they would say stuff like, or Stan Lee-esque hype that would appear, even in the 70s and 80s, when it wasn't Stan Lee writing the captions anymore, but stuff like the battle you demanded, or action fans, this one's for you, or that kind of thing. Dealer's Choice sometimes feels like it needs that kind of it needs a Stan Lee caption on the cover, because it is sort of action fans, this one's for you, despite being this sort of comic book inspired world, certainly there's a lot of Wild Cards narrative that isn't very comic booky, where they sort of try to deliberately eschew the cliches of sort of good versus evil or whatever else, and just kind of tell more layered stories that are science fictional and involve superhuman powers, but that have a little more depth to them, and whether it's a fascinating character study or just something dealing with the complexities of organized crime, or any number of situations, whether criminal or political or even romantic, right, or psychological, all of that stuff, just with the sort of patina of this conceit of a world of superhuman powers. So I think Dealer's Choice is the one where they sort of give some concessions to their roots. So yeah, there's just the conceding the fact that like there is a certain just childish thrill in just watching unfold, in this case in prose, but still seeing something unfold before your eyes of just superpowered good guys fighting superpowered bad guys. And the book is loaded up with some of the fan favorite characters who, I mean, I guess you could say every Wild Cards book has its share of fan favorite characters, but in this case specifically like fan favorite aces with sort of some of the coolest superpowers. So like Turtle and Modular Man and Carnifex are all, I know Modular Man's not an ace technically, but yeah, they're like three of the lead characters with really kind of cool superpowers and just cool gimmicks. The Turtle, who I've talked about before, obviously is a fan favorite for good reason. And but then meanwhile, even as supporting characters, you have Black Shadow is in there, Mr. Nobody is in there. Some of the characters who are always sort of supporting characters but still are just kind of have cool powers, like Pulse, who can turn into a laser, Cyclone and Mistral, who create hurricanes, and you see it all kind of unfold, all these characters just kind of throwing themselves into this battle. So it's really, it is like it's like Secret Wars, or some other like huge superhero crossover where all the heroes team up to fight a threat. I think Secret Wars is the one that comes to my mind, because that's sort of like the classic primal, like just get everyone in a room and they start fighting. In this case, kind of Ellis Island, aka the Rocks, is that place that everyone's just kind of thrown in, and a lot of action movie type violence. Especially, I mean, back then, I suppose the analog would have been something like an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie or a Stallone movie. Now, of course, there actually are superhero movies that you can use as your point of comparison, but it's whatever, Avengers Endgame or whatever, like this is what it's all been leading up to. It's a really large fight. It would be, if you were to adapt this one to the screen, it would be definitely one of the most CGI heavy of the films, I guess. If you had adapted every Wild Cards book up to that point, I think this might be the most special effects laden one, which even in prose form I think is really thrilling, particularly because you've got some really great authors. Walter John Williams, who is really fantastic, I think, at prose description of Wild Card powers. George R.R. Martin, who contributed prose to 6 of the first 7 books, but then after that probably started working on Game of Thrones, I imagine, but didn't seem to have as much time to devote. Still editing the books, of course, but either unable or just didn't have the time to contribute prose. But he comes back, which is always kind of nice whenever Martin can contribute prose, because it's so incomparable. So he's in there writing The Turtle. Walter John Williams is in there writing Modular Man. John Joseph Miller writes Carnifex, a great kind of two-fisted, just sort of Wolverine-like character. And actually, George R.R. Martin actually writes 2 characters for this one, because he also writes one of the villains from one of the villains' point of view, a character named Zelda, who I don't know if I talked about. She's actually a pretty minor character in Volume 9, And I don't know. I don't know enough about the Wildcards creative process to know whether they knew that Zelda would be a major figure later. I kind of get the impression that no, that maybe she was a supporting character in Volume 9, and maybe Martin maybe just kind of took a shine to her and said, oh, I kind of like this girl. I want to write about her because she's created one of the few times where the writer of the character isn't the creator of the character, where Zelda was created by Walton Simons, but is being written in Dealer's Choice by George R. R. Martin. Stephen Lee writes Bloat. So we get to get inside his head. We already were inside his head a lot for Volume 9, so this kind of gets to the payoff to his arc that was begun in the previous book. And then Wayangari, an original Australian character who was created by Edward Bryant for Volume 4 and has not been seen since, kind of comes, and I can't remember if I already talked about this, but the idea is that the dream time, which is this sort of, that in the context of the Wildcards world is definitely a real place that can be accessed by Wayangari and some other aces. Does that mean that it always existed, and the wildcard virus made it more easily accessible? That's one of those questions that I guess is up for fan debate, but the point is that within the context of this book, Bloat, who seems to be conjuring all these things from nothing, that, like I mentioned before, turning Ellis Island into a real island with castles and caves beneath it, all with this sort of Dungeons and Dragons sword and sorcery motif. So creatures, and I think there's a dragon underneath the cave at one point in this one. And he's just sort of summoning this from nothing, sort of in defiance of Albert Einstein, that there's only a finite amount of matter and energy in the world. Whereas all this extra matter it's coming from the energy of the energy or matter of the dream time. And he actually is depleting the dream time, which is why Wayangari gets involved. He's sort of been hanging out in Australia all this time, but he and other adepts, other people who are able to access the dream time, are all aware that Bloat, who doesn't really know that that's what he's doing, doesn't really realize he's taking this power from somewhere else, but he's essentially, and there's a metaphor. I think Greg and I might have talked about this, that there's certainly a metaphor of sort of Western civilization, sort of blithely and ignorantly, Bloat being, at least within this framework, almost Bloat being kind of a metaphor for gluttony and ignorance of your typical young Westerner, polluting, depleting the resources, polluting the sacred space. So Wayangari becomes sort of the point man, as all these adepts realize that something is going wrong. Somebody has to do something about it, and Wayangari kind of volunteers to go to New York, explain to Bloat what he's been doing, and if he's not willing to stop, he has to do something about it. Wayangari created Sewer Jack, the were alligator, the character who is kind of like the Hulk, who gets angry and turns big and green and monstrous, only instead of a big green man, it's a big green alligator. He gets to show up in this one, as does Vagabond with her, or Vagabond herself doesn't show up, but her stories had as supporting characters a couple of cats, the Black and the Calico. And there's an image that I've always loved where Wayangari has to get out to the rocks, get out onto the waters and swim to the rocks, or since he can't do that, that's not really practical. So he gets Sewer Jack, the alligator, and just kind of rides on the alligator, and then the black cat, who has sort of become very much a friend of Sewer Jack, doesn't want to be left out of the party, so he sort of plants himself right on the alligator's head. It's a great image. He's sort of like sitting right between the alligator's eyes and looking straight ahead as Wayangari sort of takes a sort of makeshift alligator craft out to the island. So that's a nice little bit that is, like I say, it's sort of a calm almost not quite comical, but quasi whimsical moment, I guess. But there's a lot of great things. There's a lot of payoff, I think, for fans of the Turtle, after a lot of watching the character sort of deal with his insecurities and his sort of what we now would think of as kind of a incel nature. Kind of a sad sack, feeling sorry for himself, even though we've been told that he's like the most powerful telekinetic on Earth. He really gets to revel a little bit in this book and really prove that yes, indeed, he is the most powerful telekinetic ever, and gets to have some great moments. He and Modular Man both sort of find a romantic interest, kind of an interesting parallel. The way those two stories play out, where Modular Man gets to meet a lady and kind of hit it off with her, and Tom Todberry, aka the Turtle, gets to do the same thing. As with a lot of so this is one of the where they call it the braided narrative. So it reads like a novel. It kind of reads like a single author novel, even though there are actually 5 or 6 authors contributing, and it switches writers whenever it switches point of view amongst the 5 or 6 characters, and it reads very smoothly. I think really, it's very slick. I think at this point, Martin has talked about the process in those, especially in those early days. He's sort of well documented the process and what they kind of figured this out as they were going. Really, every step of the way, every time they kind of created a new Wildcards book format, it was truly creating it. There was no precedent for a lot of this stuff. There were shared worlds, but the way that they ended up structuring it was kind of unprecedented in a lot of ways. But now we're up to book 11, and it does feel like they've kind of codified some things and maybe had they'd worked the kinks out, I guess, and they sort of I'm assuming, because Martin has never, I can't think of any place where Martin has really talked about the nitty gritty, or any other writer involved in Dealer's Choice has talked about the nitty gritty of actually putting it together. So maybe it was very tortured, and maybe there was a lot of learning curve there too. But it feels like when I read it, it feels like they had the process just really really slick. Like it reads nicely, and right through the end. I mean, they the logistics of it, with all the 6 characters. I think I've named them all, right? Bloat, Zelda, Wyingari, Turtle, Modular Man, and Carnifex, aka Billy Ray. As with all of the braided narratives, there are moments where like 2 or 3 of those characters might intersect. But for the most part, you're looking at like 6 parallel threads. And in this case, I feel like this one really is impressive in the way it takes those 6 characters and makes each of them really essential to the big climax. It's the logistics of the ending are really impressive. And I think that's true with most of the Wildcards books where they pay off, and really most of the books in general, but particularly those where they kind of pay off these long-going arcs, which is what like Volume 3 did, Volume 6 and 7 in tandem did, and now 11. Just taking a lot of different threads and paying them all off, and getting there where you don't feel like you've wasted your time. After reading all those books, I can certainly think of other longitudinal things that I've followed, thinking like, oh, the ending's going to be really good, like, and then you get to the ending and it's like, oh. With Wildcards, it's never like that, which I think is probably why they've kept me addicted this long. They always stick the landings, I think, and Dealer's Choice is one of those examples where it's like, like when you get all those 6 characters in a room together at the very end of the book, and see the way that they all 6 of them intersect to make the ending, to make things work out as they do for this big climax and payoff. Very satisfying, really good. To be honest, volumes 8, 9, and 10 are, all of them have things to recommend and things that I like, but I actually think of them as kind of a low point in the series, because I think the first 7 are just so great. 8, 9, and 10 feels like a little bit of a dip. I think 11 is the one where it gets you back up there, and it really feels like it kind of makes that whole arc of 8 through 11 really just sing and feel like, oh, it was worth it. It was worth getting through some of the rough spots because it all came together in a really clever, climactic way. So I think 11 is kind of almost a return to form in a way. It's really solid. And so thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.
So my honey and me go to a counselor to try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing, but before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.